All right, why don't we go ahead and call the Historic Preservation Board meeting to order at 5 o'clock. Could we please have the roll call?
Board Member Blake,
Here.
Board Member Moore,
Here.
Board Member Cordaway, Vice Chair Walter,
Here.
Chair Folks.
Here. Great, we have quorum and hopefully Rob will join us shortly. So we have the minutes of July 27th. Are there any corrections, additions?
I have none.
I'll make a motion to approve the meeting minutes.
All right, do a second.
I'll second that.
All right, any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Board Member Blake,
Oh, aye.
Board Member Moore, Vice Chair Walter.
Aye.
Chair Folks.
Aye. I said voice vote, so I didn't do a roll call. All right, oral communications. This portion of the meeting is for those who wish to talk about an issue not on the agenda, limited to 3 minutes. Do we have anyone who would like to speak on something not on the agenda? Yes. Oh, so come up here to the microphone, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Indu Adhikari. I'm an immigrant from Nepal. We came here about 20 plus years ago from Nepal. In 2020, we bought a house right across from here, 91 North 1st Street. People call it White House. And so, this is the first time I have been participating in this meeting. Nice to meet Susan and everybody. Regarding our, is this the time I can share a little bit about our house and my questions and to the committee, or do I have to wait for the discussion?
This is, so your house is not on today's agenda. This is just questions
No, this
about.
is the first time I am here. Is that?
Gotcha.
is
Yeah,
there-
if they're quick questions, because you're limited to 3 minutes, if they're longer questions, it may be better to wait and talk to staff after the meeting. So.
I'll be very quick about our house. I heard we did a lot of renovation to our house last year since we bought this. You can see that. Still, it requires a lot of repairs. And at this time, we are a little bit exhausted with all the, the financial thing and other things. And we heard about this Mills Act program. We would like to be considered in order to maintain the historic nature of the house. And we are very fortunate to get this responsibility. We would like to know more about it. So this is my agenda. I mean, like my question, concern, discussion topics I would like to share with you.
Right. So we're going to be talking about the Mills Act actually in this meeting and several meetings to come because we're redoing the act. So we're actually going to talk about it later on today. Today, we're going to be talking about penalties, which is not the most exciting part of this act, but the goal is to increase the number of Mills Acts. Suggested to the City Council, we have more for just the cases as you're talking about, where you have a lot of renovations you have to do to a historic structure, and it's very costly, as several of us know from personal experience. So, I encourage you to either watch here or online, and we'll be talking about it later on today. But it's going to be a several month process, so it's probably something that you'll have to. You can go ahead and file an application now, but we're going to be changing the program quite a bit. So I'd stay tuned, and hopefully, it'll be good for the whole community. All the people who have older houses will have a lot more opportunity to get some tax relief. So
Thank you so much. And I would like to be involved in the council as well, if I get opportunity.
Yep.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. All righty. So moving on, board and staff announcements. Do we have any announcements?
I was just going to note that you will be getting an invitation to the annual boards and commissioners dinner, which I believe should be scheduled for November 28th.
Okay.
That'll be coming from the city clerk's office. Looking again, city clerk's office or city manager's office for that invitation.
Yeah, the city clerk's office will be sending out the invitation in conjunction with the city manager's office, but I will also be involved in the scheduling coordinating. So you'll be hearing information from myself and from the city clerk's office.
Great. Thank you. Anything else? All right, moving on to our public hearing. We have a public hearing on 150 Alice Avenue. So I will turn over to staff. Your reports in your packet.
Okay. This is an application for a historic resource alteration permit for 150 Alice Avenue. This is a non-landmark structure within the Alice Avenue Historic District located at the intersection of 3rd Street. This is a single-family home constructed circa 1947 in a vernacular style. The existing roofing is Cal Shake fiber cement that was installed in the 1980s. The application for the historic resource alteration permit is necessary because the proposal for new roofing does constitute an alteration due to the different type of roofing. It's not just a material replacement that would normally be seen as routine maintenance. Such board action is required. The applicant is proposing to use certain T presidential composition siding as shown here in the Solaris Country Gray color. Staff does recommend that the Historic Preservation Board adopt a resolution recommending approval of the Tier 1 Historic Resource Alteration Permit based on the analysis contained in your staff report. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any questions of staff? Okay. All right, then we'll open the public hearing. Anyone from the public like to speak on this item?
I'm the owner of the property. The house originally had composition roof on it. I put the roof that's on there now. There was a class action suit against the company that made the product. It's crumbling, you can't walk on it. So it's been a nightmare. So I'm happy to go back to the original material. I do have a question about, I have a carport garage patio cover that goes between the garage and the house. That garage sits behind the house. It's been there more than 60 years. I've maintained and preserved it for over 35 years. It needs a roof as well. I was wondering what can I do about that? You can see it from the street. I have photographs from the 60s that show it.
Yeah, Daniel, do you want to address that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can comment on that after the public hearing is closed.
Okay, all right. So yes, and that was added later, correct? That was added.
That was added. There was a pool put in 1960, and talking with the original sons of the owners that built the house, they put this, they called it a lanai. They built it in when they put the pool in. So and the pool was put in 1960.
Okay.
And I have actually a report from the city of San Jose that shows a drawing of it and also shows photograph where you could see the carport from the driveway that was not in Daniel's report. I don't know if you're interested in seeing that.
Sure, if you've got an extra copy.
Yeah.
Pass that around. Thank you.
So can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm a little confused. So for the application you've submitted now, are you not including the roof as part of that? Was it just the main house and then now you're asking to add that to this application part?
I wanted to do the whole property, the garage, the house, and this patio cover. But the patio cover is not a permitted structure. So Daniel said that, he can't issue a permit for that. But I need to maintain it and preserve it. So I'm kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place on what to do.
Well, unless, I mean, Daniel can chime in, but if it's not if it's a non-permitting item, and it's not a historical component, and then I don't know if it's
Yeah.
something we would be addressed in the building and planning department separately.
Yeah, again, I can address that once we're done with public
It
comment.
can be seen from the street, and though, and my understanding is for the historic overlay that we're not supposed to change the looks of our properties from the street view. So.
Any questions of the applicant? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone else wish to speak on this item? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. And Daniel, we can, I know you and I
Yes.
talked a little bit about this, but
Yeah. So unfortunately, the patio cover that connects out from the original detached garage to the home is not permitted. We did look into the city's permit records, and I do have a copy of the residential unit property record from the Santa Clara County Assessor's Office. So it is a unpermitted structure. Now, the city council's code enforcement policy generally limits the staff ability to proactively go after property owners for outstanding violations unless they are currently active in terms of illegal construction. So in this particular case, that structure is there, and we're not going to open a code enforcement case against it, but the city cannot allow a building permit for a new roof on an unpermitted structure. So the approval document that's in your packet basically indicates that the approval is for the legal portions of the site, which would be the house and the detached garage. And if there was a permit, we could allow that other structure to be re-roofed as well. But it does appear that at the current moment, there is not. So unfortunately, that basically leaves the property owner with the choice of either just leaving that segment of the structure just with the previous existing roof or having to demolish it.
So in the packet, as part of the, I always forget the document, the
resolution.
DPR picture has a picture of the driveway with looks like a carport in the back. Is that the structure that we're talking about?
Now, this is, well, yeah, if you're looking at the property. Okay, let me actually, give me one moment. Let me pull up the
I'm just
packet.
looking at the picture that's in our packet.
Sure.
Page 13.
Well, it's color.
Pull that out.
But while you're pulling up, back to the question to you, Daniel. So today, we can approve the roof for the main house
In the
and
garage.
and everything, minus the other piece. And then
Correct.
He'd have to work on that separately with the city on how to address that.
Correct. So,
And then would that roof have to come back to us for that piece too?
I mean, he could seek a historic resource alteration permit to try to legalize that structure, but I don't see how it would possibly be approvable under really any standard, since it wasn't designed in such a way that would conform with either the city's local guidelines or the Secretary of Interior guidelines. So that's not to say he couldn't propose a replacement structure, but the existing structure, it probably would be very difficult to accomplish any sort of legalization. So this is in your packet. This is the 1977 survey, clearly showing that there was no structure here connecting the garage to the house. Now, in the photo that's included in the document that he provided, which I do have a copy of, it is there. So it came in at some point after this drawing was sketched out. So we know it existed after the city had jurisdiction over Alice Avenue, after the city's incorporation. And we also know we do not have any copies of a permit, and that's been validated both in our records as well as that document that was provided to you, which shows no mention of a building permit. So unfortunately, without any way to substantiate the original legality of that component of the property, the city cannot issue a building permit for the new roofing.
Can I say something?
I'm afraid the public hearing is closer at the moment.
Well, the document I showed you.
And to the extent that the resolution does provide us, staff, the director, leeway to allow re-roofing of that component if we find some mechanism to substantiate that it was a legally constructed structure. But other than that, it's pretty much outside the scope of the HPB.
So there is, I mean, it's been there an awfully long time and I can't remember the date. Has it been there 60 years?
Has been there since probably 1977, 1978,
So
or at least afterwards.
is there no way to look at it as a structure and determine whether it's,
So the concept of grandfathering generally means that it was legally built and then now the rules have changed and then maybe it no longer conforms with the current standards. But if it was legally constructed on day one, it's still legal today. Now, we do have situations where structures were built prior to building permits being required by the county, prior to the city's incorporation, and that's a little different. But that's not the situation that is presented here.
I can't tell on this photograph what piece you're talking about.
I think it's the
Can you?
Carport at the end of the whole driveway.
Okay,
So at the end of the driveway, you see that little rectangle opening and you see a trapezoid.
yeah.
Oh, if you use your mic.
Daniel, can you go to page 13 of that document? It shows a picture though, or Google Maps. Just so we're looking at the
Is
same.
this what you're looking at?
Yeah, that,
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out, make sure we're talking apples to apples.
Did you say this was not a historic property, but it's within a historic district?
Which makes it historic. I mean, it has all the same protections as a landmark.
But nonetheless, this is not part of our topic today anyway, so we should be moving on, correct?
Correct. So again, the resolution does provide leeway for us to allow re-roofing of that component, but this is what we're looking at here. This connects from the original house to the detached garage.
Okay.
Any other discussion, questions?
I have one. There was another structure on Alice Avenue that was like a shed roof that came out. It's on the opposite side of the street from this gentleman's home. It was unpermitted shed roof that came out on the side of the property. And we ultimately like grandfathered in that. I'm sorry, I don't have the house number in front of me right now, but it was an unpermitted addition to the side of the house, close to the fence line. And there were issues about whether the setback was appropriate. And because it was pre-existing non-conforming, there was a determination made that they would just grandfather it in. And I'm wondering if we need to take a look at that, but I don't know if it's appropriate, but I needed to throw it out.
I mean, I'm afraid I don't recall. I mean, he does have recourse to apply to legalize the structure. And that would have to come back to the board. And we don't want to prejudge that potential application. And then the board would need to make a determination that that is consistent with both the local historic guidelines and Secretary of Interior standards. But again, you're correct. That would be a discussion for a future meeting should he proceed with an attempt to legalize it.
Any questions?
And so this house is, I've seen it, it's on the list of, on the inventory. It's not just, the house itself is listed. And the house was purchased this time around in 86. Okay, so, and he bought it as is and it looked like this. And I'm trying to be efficient here and to be helpful, to our residents. If the request is to, approval for re-roofing, it's a general statement and it's not finite to any specific part of the structures, right? So is it beyond our reach to just be able to say, well, I mean, it is what it is. We're all together now.
Yes, that is.
We're in the army. And
Yes,
so
at
we
the
can-
moment, that is beyond your reach, yes.
And so, we could say, well, when he bought this house almost 40 years ago, he bought as is, and is it, maybe his fault that this was done. So what's the most efficient thing? What's the most responsible thing we could do, I guess? And could we just clarify since we have the picture up, this request I thought would be for every shingle we see. So can we back up and say, okay, we're exactly talking about this, but not that, but not this?
So let's see here. The approval would be for the original portions of the property. So that would be the house proper plus the garage. Now there is something else going on in the back that also probably would be a question as to whether or not that's legal and whether or not we could issue a building permit for roofing. Now, the determination whether or not a component of a house or the site is legal is really an administrative determination, again, outside of the board's direct purview. And the resolution that's before you does allow that approval for the additional roofing to extend beyond just the house and garage if staff can substantiate the legality of those components. Now, unfortunately, if a property owner buys a house with a violation on it, they inherit that. It does not matter how long the violation has been outstanding. There is no blanket amnesty unless the city council wants to take action to legalize past actions in some way, which they have not. So again, we will work with them, but as far as the documentation I have seen, I do not see any proof that this was ever permitted by the city of Campbell, which had jurisdiction at the time it was constructed.
And so it is where your cursor is. And you can almost, the roof almost has different coloring, right? It almost looks a little pink. So right next to the pool, the bottom half of the pool.
Well, and yeah, again, I think probably would be appropriate for the board to take action on the resolution.
Right. Okay. Great. Do we have a motion?
I make a motion that we take resolution number 2022-07, the Historic Preservation Board, City of Campbell, recommending approval of a Tier 1 historic resource alternation permit to allow removal of existing fiber cement shake roofing and installation of serpentine residential Solaris composition shingles to an Alice Avenue Historic District property commonly known as the Richard and Leah Stronghouse, located at 150 Alice Avenue in the R16H Single Family Residential Historic Overlay Combining Zoning District.
I'll second that.
All right. First and second, any discussion? Seeing none, can we have the roll call, please?
Board Member Blake,
Aye.
Board Member Moore,
Aye.
Board Member Cordova.
Aye.
It's on, just bring it closer to you.
Aye.
Vice Chair Walter,
Aye.
Chair Folks.
Aye. All right, that passes. Thank you. We'll move on from public hearings to new business. We've got the draft code of conduct policy for boards and commissions. Let Daniel talk about this. Or-
Actually, me.
Oh, I thought you talk about this.
No worries. Rob Eastwood, Community Development Director. So let me do some introduction, although it does have a memo attached. So going back to August of this year, the City Council did provide direction to the administration to prepare a code of conduct for all the boards and commissions. In broad terms, the code of conduct doesn't intend to tread into areas that are already determined by state law, which is if you have a financial conflict of interest, say you're weighing in on a decision or recommendation on a property to which you own or have property interest, you should not be doing that. And that's well established by law. They wanted a code of conduct that addressed potential conflicts of interest or an appearance of conflict of interest. And it was the intent that this would provide a bit more direction, guidance to any board member, any commissioner in that territory, and more fulfill the statement of values. I think when you were appointed to this board, you signed that statement of values. The board at that time, and the video is available if you ever want to look at it, they talked about different scenarios of what a potential conflict of interest is. I think broadly, some of the interest and concern was if a board member or commissioner, in addition to your duties in this position, you perhaps were as a member of an advocacy organization or a group that is known, and you have the right to do so. But if there was a scenario where those two things would come together, the city's business, the business of this board and commission, and that advocacy organization, they wanted to send out clear rules to avoid that conflict. And so one scenario would be, I was making this up, say you were a member of the Sierra Club, you were president of the Sierra Club, and the city council was weighing in on some issue, environmental issues, say riparian setbacks or environmentally sensitive things that they were evaluating. And they wanted to avoid a scenario where a member of a board of commission perhaps had a part, or it was even on the make recommending actions, or known that the city was weighing in on determining something, but at the same time was also going off and representing themselves as an example, the president of the Sierra Club, and writing letters to the city council saying you should take some sort of formal direction on that, which could be aligned or contrary to the city's position. So it was really in that field. It wasn't the direct financial conflicts of interest. It's more of a matters of representation, that they didn't want boards and commissioners and board members to be representing themselves both in the position you're in, where you make formal recommendations, but then also outside the confines of Campbell, acting on behalf of a separate organization to try and sway the city. So this is what's before you. The council wanted all the boards and commissions to review the draft code of conduct. They wanted your comments, and under the schedule, once all the boards and commissions have, they're tentatively scheduled either late November or early December to consider adopting it. If it does help, it's on the screen. I'll just read the key points. Again, the focus is on the perceived conflict of interest. A member of a city board or commission shall not participate in any decision in which the member has a perceived conflict of interest. And this means a situation where a member is affiliated with a person or organization that has taken a position on a matter coming before the city council, and the matter would appear to a reasonable and well-informed person to have aligned his or her interest with that person or organization in such a way that it would affect the independence, impartiality, objectivity of the member's role as a board member or commissioner. So there's two direct examples that are put in here to provide a bit more guidance. And the draft code of conduct said these are prohibited actions that would involve a perceived conflict of interest. Example one, representing, appearing for, or speaking on behalf of a person or organization with which the member is affiliated on a matter that has come or will come before the city council or any city board or commission. So that was sort of that Sierra Club example I presented. The second one can be a bit more nebulous and open to answer any questions you have on this, if I could help. This one says representing, appearing for, or speaking on behalf of a person or organization with which the member is affiliated before another governmental agency on a matter pending before that governmental agency that has come or will come before the city council or any city board or commission, and on which the city has not made a final decision. That can be a bit nebulous. I'll give you one more case study, and I can't imagine how this would come before the historic board. But it's a case study that actually kind of sparked some of the interest in this, and I think it's in the record. So right now, the city is preparing its housing element, where we have to designate how many housing units we are building in the next 8 years in compliance with state law. It's gone through numerous planning commission and city council meetings. If, for example, a member of planning commission or another body was both in that process making recommendations, and then separately had gone off and as a member of an advocacy organization, say a housing organization, had written letters to the state advocating that Campbell should take a position on housing in one way or another. This speaks to that. So there might be situations where the city has to submit something to another agency, state, federal. The city is still negotiating that business, making recommendations. They want to prohibit a commissioner or board member acting outside of the city capacity and trying to influence or direct that decision on behalf of a separate organization. So with that, again, the schedule is to take any comments, questions you have to the city council. We'll consider this in late November, December. But of course, I'm happy to answer any questions or you may have.
If I can get to some clarification, not that this necessarily will happen, but like you were saying, so if, for example, so the planning commission, someone's on the planning commission is also representing this other organization. So do they just recuse themselves from the planning on that particular topic? Or is there another step that they have to do besides the traditional recuse themselves on that topic, still show up to the meetings, talk about everything else except that item, leave for that item, come back? Then the next day they're back in front of city council talking about the project that they're representing? Or is there a bigger component that they have to make sure there's separation? Like, do they have to step down from the planning commission for that duration of that entire project or whatever they're discussing and then try to reapply? Is that the kind of severity that happened?
So these are all good questions. So one caveat, I'm not an attorney. And my first question would be first piece of advice would be if you perceive something in this realm coming up, talk to perhaps a community development director and the attorney to get good advice, because every situation is a little different. I'd say in general terms, you can play both roles. If you were clearly a part of an advocacy organization and that item was coming before this body, you would have to recuse on that item. That's pretty clear. Going forward, needing to step down from one or the other, I think that's a bigger conversation. If the conflict would continue continuously and you couldn't act in your role in a manner that was constructive, I think the advice of the attorney and the city would say it's an ongoing issue. We need to deal with it, but it would be case by case.
I'm just pleased to see that the recommendations here are in line with the statement of values the city has used for a number of years now, and with the ethics training that we are required to take. So I appreciate the coordination with that. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
One other question, sort of related, but not, more for Daniel, just to get a clarification. So hold on, real quick. So at the last council meeting, where Rob was there to present about the Mills Act component, we were saying that we couldn't have a quorum there at that event. And I just wanted some clarification because we weren't speaking, we weren't making decisions. We were just going to be there to listen to the discussion and the outcome of that from the city council. I was trying to understand why, like, all of us couldn't be there to hear that.
Sure. So we did, I can speak to it. I didn't, Daniel had asked me first, so I didn't want to, and I actually had given, we were waiting on an attorney response and I had given a conservative answer. And it's interesting, the attorney came back later and said, well, there's a chance you could come. So I'll give two answers. Again, things are very nuanced. So one is per the Brown Act, you're a formal recommending body. Anytime a majority of you are together, the public should know because you could be swaying the business and they need eyes into it. That's the basic principle of the Brown Act. There's exceptions to the Brown Act. If for some reason you're going to a conference together, you have to be there. If you're going something like the State of the City events, some issues like that. I think the initial concern, that one's kind of unusual because you were a recommending body and the decision-making body was actually making the decision, and that was a noticed hearing, right, in which the item was coming before the council. It was a bit unusual. You usually don't have those. But I think the initial feedback was, since three of you were together, the question is, number one, is there a majority of you together? And then question number two, are you together perhaps discussing business that would become before your body? So if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then three of you should not be together. That's a general principle. So my initial read is you were together and perhaps you could discuss the body. Now, interesting enough, later, and the message might have gotten back to you too late when we talked to our attorney, he said, well, as long as you're not together, perhaps discussing business, in that instance, it could have worked. So it was an unusual situation. Again, you were at a notice Brown Act hearing. The item you had recommended had gone beyond this body anyway. It was before the city council. So it was a little of a unique situation.
I'm going to weigh in on that briefly. Our intent was to support what was coming before them and to support Rob when he presented his information. That was our only motivation for being there. Or if anybody had questions, we could answer questions, but we weren't coming as a quorum and we weren't coming to represent anything. But I guess we didn't make that as clear as perhaps it needs to be made.
Yeah, and totally understood. And I believe, going forward, you have a big work plan item before you. And at some point, this will come back to the council. And I'd say the council should hear from you. You have very constructive, good feedback. Editorial comment, Commissioner Corway gave a very good presentation. Many council members were impressed by. So when we do get to the point this goes back, if you would like to, as a group, be there, we'll just take the appropriate measures to make sure that's done in the right way.
We could just spread out through the audience. Make sure we're 6 feet apart.
We'll have designated seating.
We're in disguise, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I, there's lots of cases where full city councils, I've sat on a state board, and Bagley Keene and Brown Act are very similar. And we go to dinner, the entire board, like a 30-person board, and we just can't talk about anything work related, right? So just one follow-up question on this item. And really going after your comment, it would probably be good to, just as some feedback to the council, and I was just thinking about this board. For example, if we had a realtor, I know we had realtors on this board before, who joins the board, doesn't perceive any conflict, then gets elected president of the local realtor association, which has PAC and does political giving and writes letters on all sorts of things. And they're the signatory for all these things. Is that a case where this code wouldn't trigger until they're signing a letter for a Campbell project or something related to Campbell? Or is it really that because they are working so closely on so many things that the city does, that the council would recommend or require them to step down? Because they've now gone into a position that's really, there's just inherent conflict there. So it'd be good to just ask them kind of how far is that, because I can see that happening where somebody doesn't want to step down, but they kind of want to wear both hats. And it's, I mean, we had this problem in Cupertino where the incoming president Chamber, who advocates for business, got elected to the city council. And we told them we couldn't be on both, like pick one or the other, but not both. So.
And just to clarify, it'd be a question of sort of timing too. So wait, I think picking apart that question, at the point you're appointed, is it time to sort of declare a potential conflict and cross that bridge, or sort of wait and seek advice if the actual direct conflict is coming? Is that
Right. It's just how proactive does the council want to be on this? Because, I think it's, I can see people, just seeing the conflict and withdrawing on their own. But in this case, it was basically, we had to tell this gentleman, well, you can't do both, right? It was kind of more of a legal determination that it just wasn't going to work. So. Anything else on this item? Okay, well, thank you. We will now go to old business. We have a report in your packet of the suggestion to dissolve our ad hoc subcommittees, since you guys have done such great work. And it looks like everything from here on out we'll be discussing here as a full board. So the thought was we really didn't need to keep them. Daniel, is that
Perfect.
over? Yeah.
Okay. That's reasonable.
So I think do we need a motion for that?
Just a motion, yes,
Yeah.
for the packet.
I'll make a motion that we dissolve the ad hoc, the Mills Act. Ad hoc sub- Adequate.
Two committees.
Plural.
Oh, there's two. That's right. Committees.
All right, do you have a second?
I'll second that.
All right, any discussion?
Yes, okay. Well, I'm just reading this, as it's written here. And my understanding, based on my read of this, was consider dissolution. So it's not, I don't know if that means a hard yes or hard no, of the two subcommittees following city council authorization to formally proceed with preparation of an expanded Mills Act program. So the city council meeting last week, the approval item, does that match up? They did authorize to formally proceed with, sort of further investigation. That they weren't authorizing anything more than that this is what they were authorizing. So we've accomplished what we set out to accomplish, is basically what we're saying here.
Correct. So they have added a preparation of what functionally will be a new Mills Act program as part of the previously authorized Historic Preservation Code update.
Any other discussion?
Yeah, so we're just, Rob, we're just dissolving the subcommittees because now our work is done.
Okay.
Because all discussions further will be here at the board. Originally, we did the subcommittee because we were trying to do things outside of the board. If we waited once a month, every time we would be taking a long time. So we did the subcommittee to expedite it, get us the information. And now that they've given us the okay to proceed, we'll just bring it and we'll discuss it every time at the board.
All right, why don't we go ahead with the roll call?
Board Member Blake,
Aye.
Board Member Moore,
Aye.
Board Member Cordoway,
I,
Vice Chair Walter,
Aye.
Chair Folks.
Aye. All right, excellent, great work. All right, we're moving along to our final and longest item, which is our study session. I'll turn it over to Daniel, but hopefully you guys have read the very detailed report. As you saw with the schedule, we have a whole lot of different pieces of Mills Act to look at. And so this will be the first of many. And I think the idea is to really focus on one aspect of it per meeting so we can get through it. So turn it over to Dave.
Okay, I put together some slides to help guide the conversation. So in August, as part of the rescission request from Mr. Key to remove his property 705 El Patio, City Council added a work plan item to our work plan for a narrowly focused historic preservation ordinance update that would focus on creation of new penalty provisions to act as a discouragement to unpermitted alterations or demolitions of historic resource inventory properties, as well as to also tighten and clarify permitting requirements related to violations of the code. And then at last week's City Council meeting, the City Council also directed staff and the HPB to work on a new Mills Act program that would be part of the Historic Preservation Ordinance update effort. So basically 3 legs to the update. The preliminary schedule, again, this is a preliminary schedule on the conservative side. Don't want to overpromise, underdeliver here. So this will start off with 3 HPB study sessions focusing on the 3 components of that update, beginning tonight with just kind of the overall scope and schedule of this process, and then discussing options for new penalty provisions. Then in December, and just as a reminder, because of Thanksgiving, the board did cancel the November meeting and then reschedule the December meeting to December 7th. The board will discuss revised permitting requirements and how we can clarify and tighten those. And then come January, the board will then discuss the facets of the new Mills Act program, and that will pick off where the subcommittee left off with the list of recommendations. And then moving forward, we will go to a planning commission study session sometime in February, March, where the commission will effectively hear the HPB's recommendations on those 3 components of the update. Following that, City Council will engage in a study session to hear the HPB and Plan Commission's recommendations, if they differ or if they're the same, confirm that they're agreeable to those recommendations, and then formally authorize staff to prepare the draft ordinance. And then we will pursue that in the early summer. I will prepare that ordinance, and that will also be reviewed by the City Attorney's Office. Following the draft, but before formal review by the HPB, we will send that copy of the ordinance to the Office of Historic Preservation. He does have review authority under our CLG agreement, and we'll make any revisions that they may suggest. And then comes the formal hearing process, beginning with the HPB in August, then to Planning Commission in September, and then to City Council in October. Again, some of these dates may be tightened up, but we have a lot of work on a lot of other fronts for our department, so don't want to overcommit. And maybe we can just stop there if there are any comments on the schedule.
Daniel, what's in the parenthetical again there after the Office of Historic Preservation?
Oh, that's just the abbreviation, OHP.
Okay, and so and who makes up that organization?
It's a state office in the Department of Parks.
Okay, okay.
So one suggestion, this is really, I looked at staff on this, that Daniel and I talked about the other day, was because this is going to go before the planning commission, is the possibility, and obviously we don't have to, it can be decided in the future, but of doing a joint meeting with the planning commission and our board so that we're all sitting at the same table.
Yeah.
And properly noticed and all that things, because I think there's a lot of details on this that, you know, I think it'd be helpful that we're there, having that dialogue and explaining kind of the whys for certain pieces of it. So just something to think about.
I just had one question, just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. The penalty provision that the city has asked us to include, that will be part of our revised Mills Act contract. There's not, it's not two different documents that'll be created as part of this, or is that going to be, one's going to be in our historic preservation revised Mills Act contract, and then separately as part of the ordinance, there'll be a penalty, or is there going to be
Sure.
reference back and forth?
So the penalty provisions are going to apply citywide to all properties under HOI, regardless if they are under a Mills Act. So we are just combining these efforts for efficiency. You're right. There's no direct relationship between these things. I mean, there is the kind of the positive in terms of the perception of, while we're creating kind of, you know, penalties, we're also now going to be creating benefits. So kind of carrots and sticks. So it works well together as a process, but they are distinct things, but they will all be contained within the city's zoning code under the historic preservation chapter, just different sections.
Okay. So I mean, I'm getting in the weeds, but in our setting up of the revised contract, everything, I'm assuming there'll be a provision in there that says penalties, see the ordinance, and then the ordinance outlines in detail what those penalties would be.
And that's actually a good question. There's already penalty provisions in the existing contracts per state law. So that's a fair point that will need to be reconciled.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And hopefully the goal of this is that there'll be enough carrots for people to do the right thing, but there'll also need to be sticks for people to do the wrong thing, right?
Well, yeah, no, I'm just asking just for clarity, because I know they wanted to put that in the ordinance like any other component of the city's requirements. Just again, getting in the weeds, but as we move forward, there's going to be other things that we might find that we don't need to get into great detail in the Mills Act contract. But I think it's important to at least have clarity in the contract that says, hey, here's these things to be mindful of. Go see these documents here, rather than say nothing. And then later on, someone gets hit with this because they didn't know it because the two documents were not correlated or at least connecting each other.
Feedback. Okay,
Go ahead.
great. Okay, so moving into enforcement options. I'll briefly summarize these options as noted in the staff reports. We did a pretty extensive survey among various California cities up and down the state to get a sense of what other jurisdictions are doing. 5 general approaches kind of came through. You have the appraised improvement value approach, basically looking at the appraised value of the improvement, and which is in this parlance of the actual building, as basically the cost of the fee. So we gave an example. Actually, I'll deal with that once for the next slide. So if assessment property, your property tax bill basically has 2 components. It's based on the land value and the structure value. So an alteration or demolition would result in a fee equal to the assessed value of the structure. Moving on, replacement value. This would be, it's very similar to what staff's recommendation was for 705 El Patio. Basically finding, getting construction estimates for reconstruction of a demolished structure and charging that cost. And then similarly, a percentage of building permit value. So when the city issues building permits, there's it's known as a valuation, and that's a standardized number that is adjusted regionally for construction costs in different parts of the country. So it's less variable than construction estimates, which are going to vary by contractor. And so basically the idea here is to charge a percentage of that valuation. So we gave a recent example of Los Gatos that actually did uphold an appeal in 2017 where they charged several $1,000s against the property owners who illegally demolished their homes. Moving number 4, percentage of appraised property value. This is actually looking at what is currently under the law for Mills Act. So if you alter a Mills Act property legally or you demolish it, the penalty under the law and under the contract is imposition of a fee equal to 12.5% the current fair market value of the property. So whatever that value is, 12.5% would be charged. So that could obviously reach several $100,000. And then lastly, some jurisdictions just establish a finite specific fee that could be determined by the city council as they deem appropriate. So you do have a lot of variability here. So to give an example of a recent home that sold on 186 Alice Avenue last year, his home sold for $1.56 million. Current value a little bit higher based on Zillow and Redfin. So looking at the appraised improvement value, so the current property tax bill shows that the appraised improvement value for that structure is $313,000. The remaining value is in the land. So that could be a fee up to $313,000 for illegal demolition. Replacement value, though, would be variable based on the actual construction estimates, which very much will reflect the current cost of labor and materials at the time. So that's going to fluctuate a bit. And then percentage of building permit value, that could go up to $307,000. And so that's based on a current permit valuation value of $200 per square foot. And that's what the city currently charges, bases building permit fees on. The example from Los Gatos, they only charge 15% of that. So that's assuming up to 100% of building permit valuation. So recommendation from the board could be up to 100% or less. And then the appraised value, that would be just some consistency with the Mills Act law, 12.5%, based on current Redfin and Zillow estimates, that could be fee up to $200,000. And then a fixed rate would really just be whatever the city council, based on feedback from the HPB and planning commission, deems appropriate and acceptable. And that could likely tier depending on the exact scope of the violation. Obviously, a full demolition would have a higher fee than just a unpermitted alteration. Now, some cities also have other enforcement mechanisms, additive to fees in most cases. These take various flavors. A very restrictive approach is just an outright development moratorium, indicating that a property subject to unpermitted demolition or alteration simply cannot be developed for a period of time, typically 5 years. We did note that this does present some very challenging situations where you would have a property likely in disrepair that could be a blight in the neighborhood, attract dumping activity, just vandalism, overgrown weeds, squatting if the home was partially there and just abandoned. That would be very costly for the city, of course, to enforce as well. A kind of a lesser version of that is a development limitation, which effectively takes away any sense of reward for a homeowner that illegally alters or removes the structure, basically freezing in time the size, placement, and location and number of structures on the property for a period of 20 years. So for instance, in the example of this 186 Alice home, if they demolished it, then any future home for a period of 20 years could only be 1,000 square feet and have the same setbacks as the house without any additional new structures. So that creates, it allows usefulness of the property, but at a very diminished level. Again, this is meant to discourage people. As noted in our staff report, this is actually a very similar approach of how we deal with tree removals. We have a very high fee for tree removals that's based on the value of a tree. Old trees are very expensive. You can have fees that run tens of thousands into hundreds of thousands of dollars. And because of that, it does very much act as a discouragement. So we've rarely had to assess fees of that type. And to be fair, people actually do ask. They ask, what happens if I illegally remove it? And we tell them that. And for most part, it works to keep them from removing it illegally. So to that end, the staff recommendation. Combination of tools. First, a fine equal to 100% of the building permit valuation. This approach has the benefit of not being subjective. So we don't have to have competing construction estimate arguments at public hearings. nor challenges to appraisals, which also are some sense of art. So you wouldn't have disagreements between professionals. And it's a consistent number that also keeps up with inflation. And in terms of the development limitation, restrict the development of that property to the existing prior standards for a 20-year period. So that allows some limited use of the property and then prevents them from being rewarded for causing demolition of a house. There is also a kind of a side note in terms of forest reconstruction and restoration. Some communities do require this. As you may recall, with 705 El Patio, that was recommended against, generally because simply restoring a building that's lost its original integrity just results in a duplication of a building. It's not actually historic anymore. Now, there may be circumstances where that is warranted. Generally, a historic district like Alice Avenue, where it's not just the individual homes, but the collection of homes that makes the district. So a demolition of a house there, even if they were to abide by paying the fine and the development limitation, you wouldn't want a new home that was just an entirely different type of architecture outside of the period of the district. So that would be an exception where forest reconstruction would be valuable. And then in terms of restoration, there's likely some potential for alterations to a property that are not so substantial that's lost all of its integrity. So based on review by the city's historic resource architect, some of those properties may be able to be restored. That was not the case with Mr. Keys's home because he modified the front to such an extent. But there may be situations where the building's only modified to a lesser extent, or maybe on the side or the rear, so that it still should be restored. And we don't necessarily need to go down the fine or development limitation route. And then, of course, any action would be appealable to the city council. These types of fines would generally be issued at the administrative level, but that is certainly a matter of discussion. I believe some communities do actually provide the initial application of the penalties to their local historic preservation board, and then that's appealable to a council. So that's an option that could be considered here, in as much as that at least provides a public venue. But ideally, we would minimize the subjectivity of the type of penalties that would be imposed. So there shouldn't be too much discussion in terms of appropriateness, and we can document what actually occurred was done willfully. And with that, I'll take any questions and we can go through these items one at a time.
All right, I'm gonna jump in. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
So on the fine component, obviously, we're going to discuss whether or not your recommendations, et cetera, but ultimately, I'm presuming it's city council and city lawyer that will make the final determination of that, or is it going to be, again, combination of our conversations along with planning, et cetera, et cetera?
So
I'm trying to wonder how much effort we need to put in that component when it may be ultimately decided by somebody else.
I mean, we still do need to circle back with the city attorney's office, but it's pretty clear that many cities have all sorts of penalty provisions that have been found legal through their local city attorney's office. So none of this is new territory, but of course we will double check. The council will be hearing from the board and the planning commission. You would be the two bodies making your recommendation to them. We are advising you, you advise them. So it is very much critical that you provide a clear recommendation moving forward.
What is the fine of any that's in a non-historic property throughout the city? Is there a fine if someone builds something that's, again, non-conforming, whatever, or is it just that they have to then try to get the permit and spend the time and energy to do that?
Sure. So this is kind of what we ran into with 705 El Patio. The city's whole concept of code enforcement is generally predicated on the understanding that a violation is just ongoing. You have a property maintenance issue and there's something discrete that you need to do to fix it. If you just demolish a building one day, the violation is just, it's done. I mean, there's nothing you can really do anymore. So what we would do is what we unfortunately had to do with Mr. Keys. There's $100 ticket. I mean, that would be the end of it, which is really the core problem here, that's all these properties are woefully exposed in that same way today.
All right. And is there any, in your research, is there any cities where they have a fine, but if the homeowner goes and fixes it, puts it back exactly the way it was. Again, we're assuming that it can be done on a historic property. And the fine goes away because they went ahead and they spent the time right off the bat. Oh, okay, no harm, no foul. I'll go back and fix it. Or is there always a penalty, always a fine, no matter what situation?
I suppose I was thinking that in a situation where it could be restored, and that's a question that we would need consultant support on, that would be sufficient. Or maybe there could be a nominal fine, or at least to cover the time to go through the whole process to evaluate that. But generally, this level of fine would be for situations where the damage is done and cannot be restored.
And then the question related to that, as well as the development limitation of 20 years, whether the person plans this in a malicious manner or not, but finds out, oop, I made a mistake, but the next day puts their house up from and sells it. What happens with all those fines, the limitations, whatever? Do they then get passed on to the new homeowner? Or is there, we need to, I say that, but we're probably something we need to address. Because if someone says, oh, I can't do anything for 20 years, if I'm a homeowner, I might say, well, then I'm going to sell and move because I can't do anything. And I'm assuming that that will go away because a new homeowner is not going to buy a house that comes in and says you can't build or do anything for 19 years because the other person.
I mean,
mistake.
the development limitation most certainly would follow the property, and that would be recorded on the title. As for the fee, we would need to circle back with our city attorney to see if that is imposed on the property or if that's imposed on the owner individually. That's a good question.
Wow, that's a pretty draconian.
Well,
If it carries over, just like I know right now your Mills Act carries over to the new homeowner, but it's a positive thing. If that goes there, that's really going to, which is, I mean, to some degree, it's could be good because if people really understand that that's probably more important per se than the penalty, the fine, to know you can't do anything, whatever, for 20 years, that may be a big stick for people to prevent from doing anything that's not correct.
Correct. And
It's still scary.
yeah, in terms of outreach too, just to note, I mean, this meeting and all subsequent meetings will be noticed to all HOI property owners. And then the council also will want us to record on the titles of each of these properties that one, they are historic. And we would likely also include a disclaimer in terms of the penalties that apply so that all subsequent buyers are fully aware and we don't have any future Mr. Key situations.
Back on the realtor,
Be a full, it'd be a disclosure issue.
right?
I think ultimately for us as a board in these, what I'm seeing and reading here, the appeal process is going to be a very important component because people will appeal it because they do it. You hear it all the time. You get, read in the paper every day, someone gets, oh, you're going to go to jail. Oh, I'm going to appeal it. And then they spend all the time appealing because they don't like the answer that they receive. So as we move forward, I think I'd like to suggest that we have some discussion on the appeal process and what we think might happen, at least coming up with enough scenarios that we can then present that to planning and city council and the lawyer, so that we don't also then burden the city with the appeal process down the road. Again, we won't be able to figure out every scenario, but if we can try to get some general ideas that might help us, craft our document and then help the city council, the future people who are running the city, manage this and not have a quagmire appeal processes.
Yeah, and I think the idea here, and I really appreciate this report. There's a ton of work that went into this, and I appreciate the recommendations. And I do like the flexibility because I can already envision, 20 different scenarios that would all require kind of a different subset of this. So I think it's important. I think one, right, the whole idea is that we never have to use this because people are all aware of it and they stop tearing down historic houses, which they've been doing forever here, because there hasn't been any real pain for doing it that way. And a lot of, you look at that house where the neighbors were well aware of it and they just looked the other way. And so the city can't, be everywhere checking on all these properties. That was a multi-month process of destroying the historic integrity of that house, and nobody told the city. And so I think, that the idea is that if this is known to anyone who has a historic structure, they're not going to be doing it that way. They're going to go ahead and get the permit. So a question though I had on the, because a lot of this is really focused on the illegal destruction or changing of a house so severe that it's, it's basically destroyed from a historic perspective. But if we're talking about an addition, a change, they take the back of the house and they put in new windows that totally don't fit the historic character and nobody notices it because they can't see it from the street. For the, if indeed the house is being, is now larger, would the development limitation be something that would be feasible? Because basically they'd have to tear off that structure to get back down to the original footprint of it? Or would this be a case where that particular modality wouldn't be used and it'd be more of the fine or more of the something else?
I mean, if somebody had done or was in active process in addition to in the back of their house, that's probably a good example of where restoration would be appropriate, because that probably wouldn't diminish the historic integrity of the building, which is generally going to be the front original portions of the building. So that could be addressed without having to go down the fine or development limitation route. It's also something that may be caught in progress, so that it can be caught before it becomes such a significant problem. I mean, really, I don't see a unpermitted addition of really coming under the purview of this. This is really more a situation where a home is just, again, actually demolished in part or whole, or they just one day remove the front facade.
Thank you.
Clarify this. So if we can't see it, because most of the time when people are coming in front of us, we're talking about things that we can see from the street side of it, even though we circle around the back of it. But if it's something that's not in our view from the street and whatever, and they've done something, does that mean that it still doesn't comply? So they'd have to do all those different things and potentially tear it down and restore it, everything? Or are we talking about all four sides of a house regardless?
I mean, it's a good question that gets back to the historic integrity of the house, which again, generally is going to be the front side facing the public perspective. That's generally the part that, because we do allow additions in the back, we in fact encourage it, because that's the area that we are least concerned about. So similarly, if somebody did an alteration to the back of the house, so they just took a window and made it a giant, sliding glass door, that's probably something that could either just be forcibly restored to its previous version, or they could come in with a permit to legalize it, which we likely would, because we would normally allow people to make minor changes to the back of their homes.
Yeah.
Again, this is intended to deal with severe violations that simply can't be remedied. I mean, if we can remedy it, that's great. We have the tools to remedy it.
And I echo Mike when I say thank you for all this work and pulling this together. Very, very helpful. It's much easier for us to digest
Yeah.
it.
And also just in terms of the point of the study session. So it's a study session, so you're not making any formal decisions, but we do need at least a majority of you to agree on all these points, because we will eventually get to the commission and we need to tell the commission, the board as a group thinks these things.
Right.
Now, if you need more time after this, if we're just running too long, that's fine. We can hold additional meetings or just push the schedule. This is why the schedule is very preliminary. Schedules do often slip if additional time is necessary, but we pretty much get one shot at this. So we want to make sure we do it right.
I'm looking at your recommendations and I have this is on page 6. I have no disagreements with any of the suggestions that you made here, the fine, the development limitation, the 4th Street construction restoration stuff, and the appeal process. I think there's going to be questions that are going to need to be answered, but we're not done here. We're just starting this process. And I did try to use 705 El Patio as a what if scenario when I went through your recommendations. And I don't have anything more to add at this point, other than we do need a stick. We got the carrots coming with Mills Act stuff, but there's got to be a message sent that it's not okay to do that kind of demolition and no permitted stuff. Yeah. I'm done.
I'm in occurrence with Susan.
Yeah.
My only concern though is the development limitation of the 20-year and how that plays out. It's the second one.
Number
Development
2.
limitation. Yes, that's what I was asking about it earlier, where it says that that would carry over to the next homeowner. And so if someone gets dinged day one and they decide that they want to run and sell it, then that next new owner gets it for 19 years and 3 months or whatever duration it is. And so that would be my only concern, that would, again, I know we're talking about, severe situations, but still having something of that limitation could be something problematic. Again, but if the appeal process allows for changes in the process where it's not, then again, people will use the appeal process to try to limit that, because they're saying, hey, we're trying to fix it up because we were going to sell it and
Right.
move, blah, blah, blah. So that would be the only thing
Yeah.
we should discuss more on that.
And I would point out, though, that code enforcement violations do run with the property. So if you buy a property that has an active code enforcement violation, you inherit it, and now you are responsible for addressing it. And the city will now start
Right.
finding you as the new property owner.
But we don't really want to get caught up in that quagmire. Wouldn't it be better to have a fine that follows the property than have a restriction on doing work to it? If that person can't deal with what they've done wrong and they'd rather sell it, wouldn't it be better to have the fine follow it? Either they pay the fine with the proceeds, or, something in there so that we don't tie up that property, because we do want our inventory.
Well,
I mean, the
again,
new owner would still have to follow the historic guidelines. They're certainly not going to add another fine to their property.
well, this is in a situation that building is no longer historic. So that building's either been demolished or it's been altered to such an
Okay.
extent. So it's now
Then are we
basically.
going to distinguish between a poor alteration and a demolish?
So, yeah, this is actually a good point of nuance. I didn't really want to get too much into the weeds in it, but the term demolition for many of these ordinances that we reviewed, it's defined to not just include full actual demolition, but alteration or removal of the character defining features of the
Mhm.
building to such an extent that it's no longer really historic.
Right.
And there's a lot of legal language that can be defined as. So that's the level of threshold we're talking. It's not just, I'm just cutting a new window one day. This is, again, removing substantial portions of the existing building materials and architecture so that, like 705 El Patio, it basically looks like a different house.
Right.
And once that happens, it's really no longer going to be historic. It's going to be off the HRI, and it will just be a normal property.
Well, that is easy to cover in the guidelines of historic preservation in the facade description, that it is the facade, because we don't ever get into the other details.
Correct. And so I think for the purposes of this discussion, when we're using the word alteration, there should be, again, that level of El Patio. It's just a significant
Right.
alteration. It's no longer historic.
Right,
It cannot be fixed.
right.
In terms of fines, yes, we do have situations where fines can be imposed on properties, and then the city can go through a process and put that on a property tax bill. There are ways to recoup money. The limitation, I would say that, Campbell is, it's not Woodside, but there are individuals with wealth, so that money may not necessarily be a sole deterrent. So having a mechanism that limits the actual use of the property may be a deterrent for those individuals, where they may see a $100,000 fine as a price of doing business for demolishing a building if they're going to make $500,000 on a new build.
Well, if they have destroyed the facade of the house and deemed it not historic anymore, that's a different scenario.
Well,
And
that's-
that
But that's a
could be
scenario we're
full.
discussing. We want to
Yes, so
prevent that. So
that-
we want to remove any incentives for people for
Right.
thinking they can do that. And before I forget, at some point, we should open the hearing up to the public for any comments. So
Good.
No, I was planning on doing that, just I wanted to get our questions on first, so I'll do that shortly. So for me, the development limitation, I think, is important just because, right, as we've seen the value of dirt in Campbell
Mhm.
go skyrocketing, right? There are a lot of historic houses on large lots. And those lots could be subdivided into 4, 5, 6 houses.
Mhm.
And so a fine, even with this fine here, to me, to Daniel's point, is the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
Whereas if your land now becomes worthless because you can't develop it, that to me is a much for a sophisticated person who's making the decision to destroy a historic home, that's going to stop them. If the city has that
Right.
tool, and obviously the city's only going to use that tool if it's something really egregious where they're, this was the intent was
Right.
to
Right.
do this, right?
Right.
And I think that's that's why giving an assortment of things gives staff the difference between
Right.
somebody who just did something wrong
Right.
or wasn't understanding something and somebody who,
Okay. That
went
makes
around the
sense.
city and basically was just, the money
Mhm.
grab. So. Any other questions before I open the public hearing? Go ahead.
And Daniel, thanks again for putting this all together. And noted that in subsequent meetings of this board, we're going to go over permitting requirements, Mills Act related things. And I'm going to want to, especially reiterate sort of the learnings that came from the city council meeting last week, just some guidelines that the mayor and city council felt pretty strongly about. But, as far as for penalty provisions, I don't see where it specifies if it's a monetary fine, where that money goes.
Well, it likely would go to fund dedicated to the furtherance of historic preservation in the community. So we do actually have that now with the $5,000 we collected from Mr. Keys. That's now in a special account. So likely it would go into there. And then some point in the future, city council would need to direct usage of that money.
And I think this one covers, it's definitely important for penalty provisions, but as well as permitting items. I haven't bought a home in the city of Campbell. I don't know what the process is if I buy a home that's on the inventory. But just, I wonder if there's more as a board we can do to help educate realtors and new homeowners of these sites. Sort of like,
I didn't mean to interrupt you. The only reason I'm sighing is because we have reached out repeatedly to realtors and we even made a special brochure for realtors. And we tried to go speak to the Realtors Association
Mhm.
and we didn't get very far. I was able to make contact with local realtors here in Campbell and get feedback from them, which I brought back to the board. And I still have contact with those realtors. And I think that the most important thing, I think, is to get the information to the property owners right now. And then maybe we can find another way to reach out to the realtors. But I think it's their responsibility as well.
Mhm.
And they may or may not be aware, but don't they have a legal obligation to
Yes.
do research and check this stuff out? I don't know.
yeah, it's something to just keep in mind. And, whether it be the realtor's obligation, and, in the end, it's the homeowner's obligation, that they need to know what they do, but so you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And, taking on a role as sort of a, just an outreach type role of, hey, this could come down to real brass taxes at some point. So this could be worth a 20-minute conversation.
Right.
Because I know there were some items that Mr. Keys said that he just didn't know. And I realize that's, that's an easy answer, but I think it falls within our purview to do what we can to make sure that the outreach and education is available directly to the homeowners.
Yeah, and as I've noted, we've noticed this meeting and all subsequent meetings, and council did make it very clear that they do want the DPR forms on the titles of the properties, which we'll do.
Yeah.
And likely with some supplemental disclosure once this process is concluded as well.
Great. So if there's no other burning questions, we'll go ahead and open up the public hearing. Members of the public who wish to comment on this, please come up to the microphone. All right. Well, seeing none, you'll have plenty of opportunities in the next year to give us your thoughts. So bring it back to the board. Yeah, close public hearing, bring it back to the board. Susan, did you have anything else? All right. So Daniel, since the study session, we're not taking a vote on anything, but you basically are just looking for, generally, we agree with the staff recommendations and we think it's going in the right direction.
Yes, we want to at least have a sense that the majority of you agree on either the staff recommendation or something else, but a majority. So that we can at least carry forward what your thinking is as a group to the planning commission in a subsequent meeting.
So in just one question in terms of, I think on the one hand, we want flexibility so staff can kind of go different directions based on what horrible, thing somebody does to their house. On the other hand, I think clarity so that there's kind of, it's clear to both the homeowner and the city, if you do this, this is going to happen to you. Do we need to give or discuss any more specificity in terms of these different recommendations, or is that something that is preferable to keep it vague because every situation is going to be unique?
Well, I mean, in terms of making sure people that there's a clear, bright line that that you're violating, that's the point of next meeting. Because, as we discussed, our current permitting requirements are a bit ambiguous, which is problematic on its own, but particularly problematic if we are going to impose fees and penalties of this type. Because then a very easy challenge would be, well, I didn't actually violate your ordinance because it's unclear that I actually needed a permit or a particular approval. And then that would be the basis of appeal. And they're having to fight about that. And if I were one of those property owners, I would actually probably, if I lost at the city council level, I would take that to court. And so we expose ourselves there by having a penalty that may not withstand judicial scrutiny. So we do very much need to clarify the permitting requirements and very much stipulate what is allowed, what is not, what requires an approval, what does not. And a lot of cities have made, that's very common. So that's something I'm working on right now, and that'll be part of the December report. And we'll get into that. And then as part of the actual draft ordinance will have a very clear definition of what the word demolition means and alteration, so that is also very clear and can withstand scrutiny. I'm sorry? Correct. So yeah, and so right now we're talking at the kind of more conceptual level, but then at some point you will actually get written text that actually has a verbatim language that will actually be codified into law if approved by the city council, and be able to then provide feedback on that. And if at that time the board feels that we need to clarify further, then we'll keep working at it.
And just to be clear, because as mentioned, if you have a non-historic structure, there isn't this type of fees in place for illegal, building an illegal thing, doing an illegal thing, not getting a permit. So is part of what either this board or the planning commission going to be looking at as recommendations for other types of fines for non-compliance, so that they're somewhat of a right? Because right now it's basically if you have a non-historic structure, you get a jail-free card, right? And if you're historic, we're going to have all this. So is there a sense that they should be the recommendations should be in somewhat of some parity about people who violate the law?
I can address, Robbie, Street Community Health Director. I think we come back to that after we see where we land on this. The main framing I put in this is resource loss. So as Daniel mentioned, if you remove a tree, that's a loss of a resource. If you remove a historic house, loss of a resource. Fair enough, if a building's illegally demolished, there is a loss of a building. The question is the amount of resource loss. So I think we'd see where this lands and come back and see, are there equivalency things to think about just with the rest of the buildings?
Okay.
Would someone that just has a non-historical structure have a problem getting a demolition permit?
No.
So it's almost moot,
You
isn't it?
can, you can demolish really any house.
Yeah.
There's a very narrow range of limitation now under state law in terms of demolishing existing housing units because of the housing crisis, and that only requires you to replace the number of units in kind.
So how many structures do we have? Is this applying to?
All of the HR list.
And how many is that?
It's 140 something
Okay,
currently.
very specific. We can probably go through and see how many are big enough to put 5 or 6 units on pretty easily.
Other questions or comments?
Okay, so we can take that the whole board agrees with staff's recommendation as currently written.
Yes.
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 Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Quicker than I thought. Back to our agenda here. So suppose that concludes our study session. Anything from homework assignments for us before the December meeting? That, I mean, I know you'll be writing another great memo for us, but anything else that we should be just thinking about?
Great question. Yes, actually. So, the next meeting, still kind of thinking through how we can look at kind of revised permitting requirements. But I think a key question is where the line is of what is actionable and appropriate at the staff level and what should go to the board. And so in terms of, obviously there's already a lot of this built into the ordinance in terms of just routine maintenance. So if you have a comp roof, replace that with a comp roof, that's fine. That doesn't ever come to the board. But there's a lot of other things that currently come to the board that maybe don't need to. So for instance, if I'm on Alice Avenue and I did want to replace a rear window with a sliding glass door, that's an alteration that requires a historic resource alteration permit that comes to the board. So maybe things like that don't need to come to the board in the future. And so what I've seen in some other communities, and I think it's probably good practice, is to start to actually itemize as specifically as possible those things that are allowable just through a staff approval and those things that need to go to the board. So if you can just keep that in mind, and that'll be probably a big part of the conversation in December.
Great, no, that's super helpful. And I think the Mills Act work we did on the positive side of things we want you to be restoring can also help, determine that. We can use that as somewhat of a basis too. That these are the things that are really important for the city in terms of preservation. Thus, they're things that, that you shouldn't be changing, right? And staff should be able to make that determination, saying no, right?
Yeah, the challenging part for us is that I understand the intent of the 2017 update, where with structures of merit, the director determines if it's consistent with the guidelines and if the building permit. If it's not, it goes to the board. The guidelines they're subjective. And so that's a lot of subjectivity on something that really shouldn't be subjective. I mean, the state is increasingly requiring that we look at objective standards. And while for now, historic properties aren't really subject to that per se, that's not necessarily going to be the case long-term. I mean, I've heard interviews with certain state legislators who are not happy that, for instance, SB 9 carved out an exception for historic properties. The technical memo provided by the Housing and Community Development Department at the state level has very much clarified that the Housing Accountability Act, which is a lot of this, the origin of objective standards, does apply to historic properties. So it likely is a matter of time, in my opinion. So the more objective we can get in our future codes, the better.
And it was very clear at last week's city council meeting that there's going to be, they were definitely making connections between historic structure or permitting requirements and Mills Act designations and the way the Mills Act has been written, and this came out of the audit, very unspecific as to what is an eligible expense. So when I went through everything, I used some discretion, right? If it was absolutely completely unnecessary, but just following the program that's been in place, it was quite liberal in what could be considered an eligible expense as far as counting towards whether or not you're using your tax refund. And the mayor felt strongly that what requires a permitting requirement for a historically significant site, regardless of Mills Act status, those are good benchmarks to have for what would be an eligible Mills Act expense. So items, inside, if you look at the audit and all the detail, new faucets, new flooring, items that would not normally be specific to, requiring a permit if you're a historically significant home, the tea leaves are telling me, just based on that meeting, that those may not necessarily be part of, what is an eligible expense. So as we discussed in December, the permitting requirements, I would keep in mind that that will have further implications as far as our Mills Act work.
Thank you. Anything else?
I was going to ask, looking ahead here at the schedules, is that in January, we're talking about the Mills Act program. And so what kind of homework should we be doing ahead of that? Even though we have kind of a general outline, is there something in more detail from your conversations with the city council, staff, anybody else that we need to do a little bit more? So we're not spending the first 30 minutes to an hour just rehashing what we've talked about before, but we can move forward. There's something we can do to help the process.
I think to Board Member Cordaway's commentary, the council was very clear that they wanted the tax savings of future Mills Act contracts to be reinvested in very specific things, critical things to these homes and their preservation long-term. Probably not thrilled that the current contracts are as open-ended as they are. So that's something we'll certainly be discussing a lot. I mean, the two of you created the memo that you presented to the board a couple times and have updated it. So my thinking for the January report is basically to use that memo as a kind of a guide, and we'll just go through each item. And we'll kind of begin where my recollection of where the board kind of landed on those items last time we discussed, and now providing some more staff feedback on whether or not that's a good approach, or if there are different approaches that could be considered. And we'll just go through those items one at a time. I mean, eligible expenses will be a big one. A number of contracts in total, which is an option, but another option would be number of contracts approved per year without necessarily having an overall cap. So they just become a natural limiting factor if we do that. So just it's really a lot of the detail work, but I think you've done a lot already. Like at this point, it's really now in our court to just take it to that next step.
And then speaking of some of that, did the city council talk about a cap on Mills Act contracts moving forward? Any of that nature, or is that something we're going to still discuss and come back to them with our recommendation?
That'll be part of the recommendation.
Okay.
I mean, again, that basically takes the form, as far as I see it, it's either just no cap, a specific cap, or a limit a number of contracts per year. And so that'll be a decision point in January.
And I give myself a homework assignment for January, just to kind of have a summary list of lessons learned from just the work that's been done about the Mills Act and city council's reaction to that, as well as I'm going to pour through the data one more time and do an even more conservative calculation that takes away all the maybe what could be considered iffy expenses and just makes it permitted expenses, because then that's the most conservative way to do it, and we can still prove the same conclusions.
And I was going to ask, did the city council, were they alarmed, disalarmed?
Yeah, not all, but
about
yeah.
the information and everything?
I think most of them were very happy to hear that a lot of that money was being reinvested into these properties. I mean, there were some questions as to should a certain amount of expenditure has been counted, but what's done is done. And I did broach too that another question that will come up is that we have these existing contracts, which are functionally legacy contracts because they were approved under a certain program. We will now have a new program, which will be much more specific and prescriptive. And there'll be a question as to should these contracts that are currently approved just run indefinitely as they currently are structured, or should at some point the city impose a notice of non-renewal and term them out? And that'll be something we'll ask the board to opine on and provide a recommendation to the council.
And remind me, because I remember seeing an email or something about the fact that we can't day two of your contract, put in a
Yes.
stipulation that says now we're ending your contract. So clarify that again.
So yes, the original recommendation, the original action from the council was to issue a notice of non-renewal immediately upon recordation, which would have termed out the contracts in 10 years. Fortunately, county assessor staff found out that buried inside, the revenue code, that pulling that trigger has the effect of immediately reducing the savings pretty quickly, which kind of undermines the whole point of the contract. So the revised recommendation, going back to council last week, was to just do a 20-year approval functionally, that we would wait 10 years from now to do a notice of non-renewal. And then they would have 10 years after that. So they would have 10 years of full savings and then 10 years of diminished savings. Now, the council opted not to do that. They just decided to reauthorize the contracts without any expiration, consistent with all the previous contracts. So they are, we'll need to get them recorded this month or next month. But they will, all 11 contracts will be on the same level in terms of no expiration. But we said, the council did that because we did tell them we would readdress this issue moving forward.
So make sure I'm understanding this, is that what from the city, from the council, or from the county, if you did day 2, day 40 or whatever, it's a non-renewal, what do they mean by a significant reduction in the savings? Is it like instantaneous, or is it
It's phased out over 10 years.
It's phased out. So every year it drops by a certain percentage of the savings?
Correct. It's not linear. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's significant enough that the latter 10 years really won't be as valuable, anywhere near as valuable as the first 10 years.
So I can speak a little to this. Former job, a lot of work on the Williamson Act, which has very similar principles. So yeah, you get, I think, a 60% savings. That might vary when you enter into these contracts. The moment it's non-renewed, one might think it's a linear progression, back up to 10 years. So year by year, you'd go up. I'm just making this up, 10%. It's actually done. It jumps in the first year. So that 60% savings goes down to 30%, something like that, very quickly. So it jumps, and then there's a plateauing effect for the last 5 or 6 years.
That's what's written right now currently in the Mills Act contract.
That's
Mills Act,
The law.
How they review the assessed value and what they're paying on taxes. That's how the calculations work.
So is there a happy medium by doing it at 5 years? So you get 5 years of your full savings, and then the next 5 years it starts, or next, and then you're 15 years instead of 20 years. So then the next 10 years, then it starts to do that. That gives them a full 15 years, 5 years full, 15 years. And I bring this up, we don't talk about details right now, but I think we should just talk about a little bit about the math to see whether or not that makes sense. Because again, if the owner knows that up front, because they're gonna want to front load some of the stuff anyways, right? If someone's coming to us to say, hey, I have to do stuff to my house, AKA a roof, they're not gonna wait 10 years to do the roof per se, if it's really bad, unless they're forecasting it. But there might be things that, again, benefits the city, because now they're saying, oh, wait, I only have 5 years at full value. I'm gonna push what I was gonna do 10 years out, like my roof or something. I might do it now and then put things that are not as important in the end. So then you get a house that's refurbished, updated, et cetera, sooner than later. So we're getting bang for the buck, and we're getting a structure that's being rehabbed in a quicker timeframe.
When was the Mills Act first implemented?
When was it?
Yes.
In the 70s?
1973 it was
Okay.
approved.
Early
But
70s?
here it was adopted.
2000.
Oh, yeah, not that long ago.
Yeah,
So isn't there a purpose to it? Isn't it to preserve real estate? I don't want to make it so, I hate paperwork. So I don't want to make it so complicated that people don't want to do it. You might like paperwork, you might like paperwork. I hate paperwork.
Sorry.
So
It's a
why make
contract,
it so
yeah.
complicated?
Yeah.
Well,
No,
you
it's
just
not
have to
complicated.
fill
It's
out
just-
the
It's just
paperwork.
that we're trying to, if, right now, we only have so many contracts with the city because the council put a limit to it, right? We're trying to open it up more. By opening up more, then the city council might say, whoa, that's too many. So if we try to do it in a manner that benefits both the city and the owner, ultimately, the owner's going to be spending money, right?
Right.
So we were concerned that over 20-year period, if we have all these contracts lined up for 20 years, and the city council won't give us more contracts to add.
We have a
then
new
I
city
can't add
council
more
coming in.
contracts. So then I'm gonna be stuck with 10 contracts for the next 50 years, and we're not spreading it out. So we have 140 residents, and we have 10 contracts right now, or 11 or 12. It's a really low percentage compared to Los Gatos, Pasadena, San Francisco. They've got probably 50% or more would be my guess of Mills Act versus the number of properties. So we're trying to expand it. So
Yeah.
if we can't expand it because the contracts are held too long, then we're hurting everybody. So we've got to figure out a balance. So we're not going to solve it today, but I'm just bringing it up.
But we are trying to save that house that has a contract.
So
That
one
is the point.
thought, I'll wade in and then I'll be quiet. So many of you, and I know Board Member Corderoy acknowledged this. So I've been in jurisdictions where there's a lot of different approaches to this. So I'll just say generally for industry standard, Campbell is on the more restrictive end of the spectrum.
Mhm.
A lot of jurisdictions look at this and say, hey, you have a historic home. Walking in, number one, you're on our list, and the ability for you to modify that home is severely constrained versus you have to go through a process. So there's a regulatory standard that keeps you locked into that home, number one. And number two, it usually costs a lot more money for you to maintain that home. So those are both two hits for being a historic home. Under those principles, and it was, I think, written in the original law, a lot of jurisdictions come in and say, hey, as long as you just maintain that house and we'll monitor you, you're good. They don't have work plans that require you to go in and document the savings and reinvestment. So it's a thought going forward. Campbell is more restricted. I know that's been the approach from council. A middle ground may be to consider that when you go in, you submit a work plan, it goes over a number of years, and it could go for 10 years, and you come back in 10 years, and the question would be, do you have a new work plan? And if the answer is no, you could non-renew the property. It doesn't bind you these 5 or 10 years. And if the answer is yes, you would not renew the property and keep going. So there's some gradations here for being restrictive and kind of overthinking a little bit too much the calculations versus total laissez-faire. But again, compared to other jurisdictions, this jurisdiction is pretty restrictive right now in its contracts.
All right, well, now we've got lots of things to think about. I don't want to steal the thunder for the next meeting, so.
I just have
Yep.
one last thing. I wanted to actually thank Rob for the work that you did and the presentation that you gave to the council. It was
Yeah.
excellent. And your banker's touch was clearly evident. And I think I know you made quite a favorable impression with the council. So thank you again for what you
Thank you
did.
for saying that.
Thank you. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting until Pearl Harbor Day.
Oh, my goodness. All right.